The last time Margaret Doyle saw her daughter, it was a Tuesday in November of 1912. She remembered because she had just been paid $2.40 for 60 hours of work in a shirt factory on Orchard Street in Lower Manhattan. She folded the bills into her shoe, the way the other women had taught her, so the men in the hallway could not take them. Then she walked back to the room she shared with 3 other families on Haas Street, and her daughter was not there. She was never told where Mary had been taken. She was told only that the girl had been seen wandering alone near the docks, that the society had collected her, and that she was in the care of good Christian people now and would have a better life than a woman like Margaret could provide. Margaret went to 3 different offices. She waited on benches. She was seen by men who wrote things in ledgers and told her to come back next week. She came back next week and the week after that, and eventually, a man told her that the records of placement were confidential to protect the welfare of the child and that this matter was closed. Margaret Doyle did not speak about this publicly for 31 years. Her daughter did not find her until 1943, when Mary was 37 years old and had been living in Kansas and then Nebraska and then back in Kansas again, in a succession of farm families who had taken her in, some of whom had been kind and some of whom had not been kind at all. None of whom had ever told her that her mother was alive and looking for her. What Margaret told her daughter in that reunion in a rooming house in Brooklyn in the autumn of 1943 is what this story is about. Because what Margaret knew and what she had spent 31 years trying to say to anyone who would listen was that her daughter had not been rescued from poverty. Her daughter had been removed from a mother who loved her by a system that was not primarily interested in orphan children at all, and that the people who ran that system were deeply, financially, and specifically connected to the same economic machinery that had made Margaret Doyle poor in the first place. This is the story of the orphan trains, not the version that appeared in the newspapers in 1912 with the photographs of clean-faced children waving from windows and the articles about the goodness of the Children's Aid Society and the blessings of the wide, open West. The other version, the one that Margaret Doyle told her daughter in 1943, the one that the ledgers and the annual reports and the commemorative histories of the movement do not include. The thing you need to understand about New York City in 1912, before you can understand anything else about this story, is that it was not a city that had accidentally produced poverty. It had deliberately manufactured it. The tenements of the Lower East Side were not a natural phenomenon. They were an investment. The buildings on Hester Street and Orchard Street and Malbury Street, the buildings where 5 and 6 families shared a floor, where the windows opened onto air shafts where nothing lived and nothing grew, where children slept 3 to a bed, and tuberculosis moved from family to family with the efficiency of a very small and determined traveling salesman. Those buildings were owned by people, specific people, people who collected rent checks every month, people whose names appeared in the society pages of the same newspapers that published articles about the tragedy of the immigrant poor. The shirt factory where Margaret Doyle worked was owned by a partnership that included as a silent investor a man whose wife sat on the board of a charitable organization that operated a children's home on 23rd Street. The man's name does not matter for this story, because his name was one of dozens of names that appeared and reappeared in the interlocking circles of New York industrial capital and New York charitable enterprise in the first decades of the 20th century. What matters is the structure. What matters is the pattern. The garment industry of Lower Manhattan was built on immigrant labor. Irish and Italian and Jewish workers, primarily women, worked 60-hour weeks for wages that could not support a family, even if nothing went wrong. But things always went wrong. A husband died of typhus. A mother lost her fingers in a machine and could not work. A breadwinner was injured on a loading dock, and there was no compensation and no insurance because there was no legal requirement for either. When they fell immediately and catastrophically into the condition that the newspapers and the charity organizations called destitution. And destitution in New York City in 1912 made your children vulnerable in ways that the destitute parents often did not fully understand until it was too late. Charles Loring Brace had founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853. He was a minister and a reformer who genuinely believed that the children of the New York poor were being destroyed by the city and could be saved by the country. His placing out system began in 1854, and by the time Mary Doyle was taken from her mother in 1912, more than 150,000 children had already been transported on those trains. The program would continue until 1929, moving somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children in total. The exact figure is uncertain because the record-keeping was often incomplete, and some records were later lost or destroyed. And that uncertainty itself tells you something important about how the system regarded the individual children who passed through it. Every public document produced by the Children's Aid Society described the program as an act of charity. The language was the language of rescue and salvation. The children were orphans and waifs. The farmers who received them were Christian families opening their homes. Some of this was true. Some placements produced real families and real better lives. The program was not without genuine instances of care and transformation, but the language concealed something the annual reports did not discuss. The placing out system was not only a charity, it was a labor market. The labor it was moving from the cities to the farms was the labor of children. A farmer in Kansas in 1912 who applied to receive an orphan train child was not simply opening his home. He was acquiring a worker. Boys worked the fields, girls worked the house. The language of the placement documents, taken in as a member of the family, treated as one of their own, described an aspiration substantially disconnected in many cases from the child's daily reality. The Children's Aid Society charged receiving families a small placement fee and required nominally periodic reports on placed children. The oversight was minimal. The agents who traveled with the trains and presided over the selection events at which children were lined up in town halls and examined by farming families who had come to choose among them in a process that contemporaries, sometimes compared to a livestock auction, moved on to the next town once placements were made. Children who were mistreated had no reliable mechanism for complaint and no practical ability to return to the city they had come from. The distances were enormous, and the placement system had no return policy. This was not a secret in 1912. The Catholic Church had been loudly objecting to the program for decades, partly on religious grounds. The children of Catholic immigrant families were being placed with Protestant farming families in a practice that the Church correctly identified as religious conversion by economic coercion, and partly on the straightforward grounds that the program was removing children from living parents who had not fully consented to give them up and who were never informed of where they had been sent. Because here is the thing that the newspapers did not report, and that the annual reports of the Children's Aid Society did not include in their tallies of children helped and families formed. A significant number of the children on the orphan trains were not orphans. They had parents, mothers who were working, fathers who were sick or absent or had simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of the industrial city. Families that were poor and struggling and sometimes failing, but families. Children who were collected from the streets of New York were not always children who had been abandoned. They were sometimes children who had been sent to buy bread and had taken a wrong turn. They were sometimes children whose mothers were at work in the factory and had left them in the care of an older sibling who had been momentarily distracted. They were sometimes children who had been picked up by agents of the charitable organizations and processed into the placement system before anyone had adequately determined whether they had a family to go back to, because the system was under pressure to move children efficiently, and the determination of family status was not always conducted with rigor. Margaret Doyle knew this because it had happened to her daughter, and she knew from the women she worked with in the factory, and from the neighbors on Hester Street, and from the women she encountered in the charity offices while she was trying to find Mary, that it had happened to other people's children, too. She knew the names of 3 other women on her street alone whose children had disappeared into the placement system in the same year that Mary was taken. None of those women were ever given a forwarding address. None of them were ever told which state their children had been sent to. The records, they were told, were confidential. The children were in good care. The matter was closed. This is where the revisionist economic history begins. The standard account treats the removal of children from living parents as an unfortunate side effect of a well-intentioned program, an administrative failure in an era before modern social work and proper record-keeping. The argument is that the people running it were doing their best with limited tools, and that the harm should be understood in the context of their time. Margaret Doyle did not believe it was a mistake. The explanation she gave her daughter in Brooklyn in 1943 was not the explanation of a bitter woman constructing conspiracy from grief, though she had every right to be bitter. It was the explanation of a woman who had spent 30 years paying attention to how the system actually worked, as opposed to how it was described in the newspapers and the annual reports and the speeches at the charity dinners. The system worked, Margaret told her daughter, because poor children were useful not only to the farming families who took them in and used their labor, though they were certainly useful there. Useful to the people who ran the charitable organizations and who needed a supply of children to justify the program and the funding it attracted. And most importantly, useful to the economic order that the system served, because the removal of poor children from the immigrant neighborhoods of New York was a mechanism for managing the social costs of industrial capitalism in a way that kept those costs from becoming politically destabilizing. The Children's Aid Society and the organizations that operated alongside it and eventually succeeded it were not independent of the economic power structure of New York City. They were staffed and funded and directed by people who were deeply embedded in that structure. The donors to the Children's Aid Society included men who owned the factories where the mothers of the removed children worked. They included men who owned the tenements where those families lived. They included men whose investment portfolios depended on the continued availability of low-wage immigrant labor and who had every rational economic interest in maintaining the conditions that produced that labor supply. Historians of the Progressive Era have argued carefully that the charitable organizations of that period served a specific economic function. They managed the social costs of industrial capitalism in a way that allowed the system to continue operating without producing the organized political resistance that might have threatened it. Poverty addressed through charity was poverty that did not become a labor movement. Children removed from destitute families and placed in rural settings were children not growing up in communities that might develop political consciousness about their conditions. The charitable enterprise was not separate from the economic enterprise. It was the part of the enterprise that presented a human face to the public. This was the argument Margaret Doyle made to her daughter in 1943, in the vocabulary of a woman who had watched how things worked from the bottom of them for 3 decades, rather than the vocabulary of academic history. The structure of the argument is the same, and the specific mechanism she described was this. The poverty that made her daughter vulnerable to removal was not incidental to the system that removed her. The same forces that kept Margaret's wages at $2.40 for 60 hours of work were the forces that made it possible to argue that Mary would have a better life somewhere else. If Margaret had been paid a living wage, she would have had material conditions the charitable organizations used as their justification for removal. The poverty was the prerequisite. It was manufactured by decisions about wages and rents made by specific people for the purpose of extracting maximum value from labor while paying minimum compensation. And those people were in many documented cases the same people who funded the organizations that then used the poverty as justification for taking the children. Mary listened to her mother in that room in Brooklyn for a long time. She was 37 years old and had spent 25 of those years in Kansas and Nebraska, moving between farming families, doing the work required of her, treated in some households with something approaching kindness, and in others treated as what she actually was in those arrangements, which was labor that did not need to be paid. She had grown up understanding herself as an orphan. She had been told by the second family she was placed with that her mother had died of tuberculosis in 1913. She had grieved accordingly. She had built her understanding of herself around that absence, and now her mother was sitting across from her, 61 years old, still working, still in the same neighborhoods, telling her that none of it had been necessary, that the poverty had been produced by specific economic decisions made by specific people for specific reasons of profit. that the record stating her mother had died of tuberculosis in 1913 was false because Margaret had been alive and working and looking for her from November of 1912 through November of 1943, 31 years, not 1 week in which she had stopped looking. The economic infrastructure of the orphan train movement is where the revisionist argument becomes most concrete and most difficult to dismiss. The railroad companies that transported the children west were not acting out of charitable impulse. The settlement of the Midwest was the primary project on which the railroad industry's profitability depended. Settled farm families were freight customers. They shipped grain east and bought manufactured goods shipped west. The orphan trains carried children on the same lines that carried grain in the opposite direction. The Children's Aid Society negotiated reduced fares with the railroads, and the railroads agreed because the children were a form of agricultural investment, future workers and settlers in regions the railroads needed populated to generate revenue. The farming families who received children were acquiring labor that adult workers would have demanded wages for. Child workers placed through charitable systems and bound by informal agreements did not command wages. They were, in the language of the era, earning their keep. The distinction between earning one's keep and working without pay is a distinction the legal frameworks of the period were not designed to clarify, particularly when the worker had been delivered by a charity organization and had no practical alternative to the arrangement. Some placements produced genuine families and genuine warmth, but the representative story was closer to Mary Doyle's. A child received because a family needed labor, used as the labor she was expected to provide, moved when the arrangement ceased to be convenient, and taught over time to understand herself as alone in the world. The Catholic Church's opposition to the program illuminates the full scope of what it was doing. The Church's objection was not only religious, though the wholesale placement of Catholic children with Protestant farming families was a documented form of cultural and religious erasure. The Church also made the specific argument that the program was removing children from families that were poor but not unfit, that poverty was being treated as a moral failing, justifying intervention, and that the standard being applied to these families would never have been applied to the Protestant middle-class families whose members sat on the boards of the organizations doing the removing. That argument was correct. The poverty that triggered removal was distributed entirely along class and ethnic lines, along the lines determined by the wage structure of the industrial economy. The children being removed were the children of people whose labor built the economy. The removal decisions were made by people whose capital owned it. The removal was funded by donations from people whose ownership of that capital produced the poverty that made removal seem justified. Margaret Doyle had worked this out by the middle of the 1920s, not through access to the ledgers of the Children's Aid Society, but through years of watching the same patterns repeat in the neighborhood she lived in, reading the labor press and the Catholic papers that covered the program from a perspective different from the mainstream press. By her 40s, her analysis matched in its essential structure what historians working with the primary sources have subsequently developed. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had occurred in 1911, a year before Mary was taken. 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, had burned to death or jumped from a building on Washington Place because the exits had been locked by the owners to prevent unauthorized breaks. The fire produced investigations and eventually some improvements in factory safety standards. It did not produce a meaningful increase in the wages of garment workers. Margaret Doyle had worked 3 blocks from the Triangle building. She had known 2 of the women who died. She had stood in the rain at the mass funeral with the other factory women and then gone back to work on Monday because she had no choice, and the wages had not changed. Mary had been taken the year after the fire. The connection Margaret drew was not that the fire had caused her daughter's removal. It was structural. The locked exits, the $2 wages, the tenement rooms, and the children taken from the streets were features of the same system. The organizations that removed the children and the industrial interests that had locked the exits were not always the same individuals, though in some cases they literally were, but they served the same economic order in complementary ways. The placing out system required a supply of removable children. The supply of removable children required poverty. The poverty required wages maintained by the industrial interests of the city. Those interests were sustained in part by the charitable management of the social costs of those wages. Remove any piece, and the rest became harder to sustain, which is why none of the pieces were removed, which is why the wages did not change after the Triangle Fire, which is why the placing out system continued for another 18 years, moving children west while the streets were cleared of the most visible evidence of what the industrial economy was doing to the families of the people who ran it. Nobody in the mainstream press wrote articles about the wages. Mary Doyle went back to Kansas after she found her mother. She came back to Brooklyn 3 more times before Margaret died in 1951. On one of those visits, she brought a notebook and wrote down everything her mother could remember about the factories and the tenements and the charity offices, and the years of looking for a daughter told her mother was dead. The structure of what Margaret described was consistent across all 3 visits, and it matched what historians who have worked with the records of the Children's Aid Society have found when they examined the program from the bottom up rather than from the top down. The revisionist history of the orphan train movement is not a conspiracy theory. It does not require anyone to have sat in a room and decided to manufacture poverty in order to create a supply of removable children. Human systems do not generally operate through explicit conspiracy. They operate through the alignment of interests, through structures that benefit specific parties without requiring those parties to acknowledge what the structure is doing, through accumulated individual decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation and that together produce outcomes that would seem monstrous if anyone described them plainly. What the revisionist history requires is only this: that we ask who benefited, that we follow the money, that we ask not what the charitable organizations said they were doing, but what they were actually doing, and whether the people who prospered had any relationship to the conditions that made the charitable intervention seem necessary. When you ask those questions about the orphan trains, the answers are not comfortable. The donors to the Children's Aid Society included men who owned the factories and tenements of New York's immigrant neighborhoods. The railroads that transported the children west were the same railroads whose profitability depended on the agricultural settlement of the interior. The farmers who received the children received along with them labor they did not have to pay adult wages for. The children who were removed were disproportionately the children of the Catholic immigrant poor, removed by Protestant-run organizations into Protestant farming families in a pattern that the Catholic Church correctly identified as cultural and religious erasure, operating under the protection of charitable language. And a significant number of those children were not orphans. They had mothers who were working in the factories owned by the men who funded the organizations that took the children. They had families that were poor because the wages paid by those same factories did not permit anything other than poverty. And those families were never told where their children had been sent. This is what Margaret Doyle told her daughter in a rooming house in Brooklyn in the autumn of 1943. She told her that the poverty was not an accident and not a natural condition of immigrant life. She told her that it was the product of specific economic decisions made by specific people for the purpose of extracting maximum value from labor while paying minimum compensation for it. She told her that the removal was not charity in any meaningful sense of the word. She told her that the people who had taken her daughter away had done so within a system that they themselves had helped to build, a system in which the poverty that justified the removal was produced by the same economic decisions that filled the donation ledgers of the organizations doing the removing. And then she said something that Mary wrote down on the last page of the notebook in older handwriting than the rest, shakier in ink that has faded more. It is in Margaret's own hand, written sometime between 1943 and her death in 1951. They took her because we were poor. We were poor because they paid us nothing. They paid us nothing because it made them rich, and then they told us they were helping. The orphan train movement is remembered today as a well-meaning if flawed attempt to address genuine child poverty. The commemorative histories describe the courage of the children and the generosity of some receiving families. They mention in passing the cases of children removed from living parents, the inadequate oversight, the labor extracted from children described as family members, the religious and cultural erasure. They present these as regrettable side effects of a program motivated by genuine concern. Margaret Doyle did not believe that framing. What the evidence supports, examined from her vantage point, rather than from that of the annual reports, is a program that served specific economic interests, funded by the beneficiaries of those interests, that removed children from families whose poverty was produced by those same interests, and described all of it in the language of Christian charity to make it politically sustainable for the 3/4 of a century it operated. The notebook is in the Brooklyn Public Library, in the Special Collections room in a box, filed under a call number that has nothing to do with the orphan trains or the economic history of the Gilded Age. A librarian found it in a donated collection in 1987 and recognized it as something worth preserving, placed it where important things are kept safe, in libraries quietly, without fanfare, without any guarantee that anyone will look for them. The last orphan who found her real mother learned in a room in Brooklyn in 1943 that her removal had not been a rescue. It had been a transaction. The transaction had benefited the railroads and the farmers and the charitable organizations and the industrial interests that funded them. It had cost Margaret Doyle 31 years. It had cost Mary Doyle an understanding of herself that she spent the rest of her life trying to reconstruct. The trains stopped running in 1929. The factories are largely gone. The tenements are condominiums now. The Children's Aid Society still exists in a different form, doing different work. The economic structure that produced the orphan trains is not gone. The pattern Margaret identified, in which the people who profit from poverty fund the organizations that manage poverty and receive public credit for addressing conditions they are producing, is a pattern with a long history behind it and a present reality ahead of it. That is what the revisionist economic history of the orphan trains asks us to see, not the story of well-meaning reformers doing their imperfect best. The story of a system that worked exactly as it was designed to work for the benefit of the people it was designed to benefit, while the people at the bottom waited in charity offices and factory floors and rooming houses writing down what they knew, hoping someone would eventually read it. Margaret knew from the day her daughter disappeared, and the man in the office told her the records were confidential. She knew from the wages that never rose, and the rents that never fell, and the factory owners' names that appeared year after year in the donor lists of the organizations she was begging for information. When her daughter finally found her, she told her everything, every connection she had traced between the man who owned the factory and the man on the charitable board, and the railroad that carried the children west, and the newspapers that had called all of it a mercy. She told it as the truth of her life, which it was. If you want to understand the economic history of this country honestly, do not start only with the men who funded the charities. Start with the women who worked in the factories. Start with the mothers who waited. Start with the children on the trains watching a countryside that was not home through the windows, being carried toward lives arranged for them by a system they could not see from where they were sitting. The history is in the notebooks. It is in the boxes in the special collections rooms of libraries in cities where the factories used to be. It is written in the handwriting of women who knew exactly what had happened to them and wrote it down so that someone someday would. Cảm ơn na. Comment, like, subscribe nếu thấy hữu ích, hãy góp ý cho chúng tôi.